Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. I am very pleased to have with me here today Victoire Rio from What to Fix. This is the fifth episode of Design for Integrity. This is a webinar series sponsored by the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion, launched in April. I am very pleased to be here with you today. This conversation today is going to be exploring the topic about toxic incentives and toxic spaces, how that translates to toxic digital spaces. I want to just jump into a few housekeeping things before we get started. First of all, here we are joining from the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations here in Vancouver, BC. We are all stewards of this land, and as we are thinking about what digital sovereignty looks like, we call on everyone to think through how we can also commit to supporting Indigenous sovereignty as well in these conversations. My name is Renee Black. I am your host. I'm a part of the Council on Technology and Social Cohesion's global policy working group. And I also run a nonprofit organization called GoodBot in Vancouver, BC, working on digital and AI policy. I do see that we have Lena here from the council. So, Lena, would you be interested in saying a few words on the council?
Sure, I'm just outside here. I don't know if you can see me. Thank you, Renee. The Council on Tech and Social Cohesion brings together technologists, peace builders, policy influencers, and researchers on polarization and cohesion to try to advance tech design, which can bring about healthier, more cohesive societies. And so we look at policy, we look at practice, and we look at products, and these kinds of conversations which connect all of that are really part of it. So really happy that you're convening this, Renee, and excited about Victoire, as always, joining us. Thanks.
Thanks, Lena. I know I put you on the spot, and I'm jealous of your outdoors. Uh, but yes, thanks for being here. And as always, we have a Slido that we will be sharing throughout the conversation. And yeah, with that, let's get started out. Victoire, welcome to the show. Please tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to this work.
Thank you, Renee. Well, my name is Victoire Rio, and I am the founder and executive director of What to Fix. We are a small tech policy and accountability nonprofit registered in the Netherlands. I ended up registering What to Fix as a European nonprofit in 2024 after a little over 10 years working on tech accountability in Asia, most notably in Myanmar. For those of you that are familiar with Myanmar, Myanmar became a bit of a poster child for social media facilitated harms in the context of the Rohingya genocide in the mid to late 2010s. And so I was based in Myanmar from 2015 to 2021, and then in Thailand for a couple more years after that, and working on a tech accountability efforts. And I helped co-found the Myanmar Tech Accountability Network at the time, which was a collective of 13 Myanmar organizations working to get platforms to improve their policies, their product, and their engagement. And sort of through that work, I engaged with platforms a lot, got them to make quite a few improvements to their services. But when it came to monetization issues in particular, I really kind of kept hitting a wall. And it was very much one of those issues where it felt like this would only get resolved through regulation. I think the feeling we got from conversation with platforms was that there was a bit of a sense of everybody else is doing it and why shouldn't we? And so if we really wanted to tackle this, then we really needed to regulate the entire playing field. And so that sort of got me thinking about how do we regulate this issue. At that time, Europe was developing its digital regulation package with the DSA and the DMA, and we were trying from Myanmar to engage in that conversation and really bring this expertise that we had and what we were seeing sort of develop in Asia, and really struggling to get into the conversation in a sense that European regulators are not too keen to listen to Burmese organizations. And so it sort of really felt like the best way forward was to register a structure in Europe, which is what we did in 2024.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean this problem of everybody's doing it. Why shouldn't we? Seems to be a pervasive problem across a lot of the issues that we end up thinking about, in digital spaces. I want to try to get a bit of a sense for how you started to understand what the problem looked like and what were you trying to solve?
Well, in fairness, it took some time, right? I first came into contact with a harms associated with monetization in 2016. But it wasn't really until early 2019 that I really appreciated what was happening and what it was that I was actually dealing with. So again, if you think about this, 2016, I was based in Myanmar, which at the time was sort of known as a Facebook first market. Websites were very non-present. Most people had never used a browser. Really, all of the digital life was happening on Facebook. And that kind of changed in mid to late 2016, where all of a sudden, sort of overnight, we became bombarded with a whole range of websites that started to push out a lot of content on Facebook that was problematic, a lot of hate, anti-Rohingya content, a lot of disinformation, and it kind of came out of nowhere. And at the time, we were trying to think through whether there may have been some financial motivations involved, and we couldn't really find anything. And so we sort of assumed that this was a new iteration of the military campaign to sort of divide the country. And it sort of in early 2019 that it really kind of clicked for me, sort of randomly, really. I was sitting in a taxi, scrolling through Facebook, looking at pages I had been researching for being highly problematic. I was in the middle of mapping this massive network of coordinated pages. And it kind of hit me that all of them actually were using a service from Facebook called Instant Articles, which was Facebook very first monetization service. And so what it kind of what it made me realize that these pages were actually making money. Now, this is happening in 2019, but if it was that these pages were already using the service when it launched in 2016, then I was faced with kind of two equally bad scenario. On the one hand, we could have had a scenario in which Facebook may have been subsidizing the Myanmar military genocidal campaign, which would have been pretty bad. And if it wasn't the military that was behind these pages, but a unconnected individual, then we were looking at a potential scenario where the platform could have actually been the incentive that led a lot of that led to the publishing of some of that content. And so I've sort of, from that moment, started sort of digging and trying to understand a bit more about those monetization practices. And I quickly discovered that Meta was releasing some data. And now it wasn't great. It was, I mean, it still is. It's essentially a CSV file that they release roughly every day that lists all the accounts that are currently part of their revenue redistribution program. But I started to back up those files so that we can kind of create a bit of an archive. And a sort of over time, as I was digging deeper and deeper into platforms' monetization services, platforms were also kind of going deeper and deeper into monetization themselves. And so really kind of saw a major growth from the time I started backing up the data in 2019, where we had roughly 80,000 accounts on Facebook globally that were earning from Meta to today, where we are looking at upward of 18 million. Maybe 16 million of these have been integrated over the last couple of years, and we're now looking at even more kind of getting added every week.
Mm. Wow. That's crazy. Can you talk a little bit about how the evolution has of the monetization practices has changed over time? You talked about the scale, but apart from this particular instant articles, what other forms of monetization have evolved?
Sure. Well, so I mean, monetization itself is not a new thing. It actually started in 2008 with YouTube, with a program called the YouTube Partner Program, which already back in 2008 was a offering a YouTuber the possibility to earn from the platform. It sort of evolved quite a lot since then. But for a long time, there was basically just YouTube. Um, Facebook came on board with monetization services in 2016 with this service called Instant Article, which was a very odd type of service. I don't know if you remember, 2015, 2016 is when links became more and more shared on Facebook.
Mm.
And so they started to roll out the thumbnail, which made links more appealing. And we kind of ended up in a situation in which Facebook was responsible for driving a ton of traffic to websites, but Google was the one that was capitalizing on the ad placements.
Mm.
Most of the website were monetizing through Google AdSense. And so Facebook was the traffic driver. Google was a cashing in on that. And so Instant Article was sort of Facebook's attempt to remedy that. And it was a very weird program where they basically told publishers that they could load their web pages directly inside the Facebook app so that it would load faster. But then Facebook positioned itself to resell ad placements on their behalf. So that's sort of how Facebook came on board. And then they started to have long form videos on Facebook and then Instagram. So we started to see programs around in-stream ads kind of getting added. But the big shift sort of really took place in 2023 when we started to see all the other platforms coming on board. So 2023 is when X, TikTok, Snapchat all launched their first revenue redistribution programs. And it's also when we started to see a major shift where those programs that used to be very connected to advertising really kind of started to split away from advertising. In the early days, really, monetization services, well, revenue sharing programs, effectively, were a were an opt-in option for publishers um, that wanted to make money to let the platforms know to resell ad placements within their video in exchange for a share. So it's effectively the publisher essentially hiring the platform to act as an ad intermediary and resell their ad placements to advertiser in exchange for a cut. And then
Mm.
in 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, depending on platforms, um, things kind of got shifted where platforms stopped um, acting as an ad intermediary in that relationship and essentially started to make the monetization program about a general performance, a general engagement. So you're no longer paid a percentage of the revenue that the platform makes on the ad. You're actually paid based on the overall performance of your content, and the money might come from various different sources. So the X a creator revenue share program at the moment has absolutely nothing to do with advertising. The
Mm.
creators are actually getting paid based on the money that X made from selling a premium accounts. So based on the sale of the premium accounts, there is a percentage of that money that gets put into a pool fund that creators that join the program may be eligible for. So that distinction's really kind of happened in 2022, 2023, and this is when we started to see as well a lot of other platforms that were not super suitable for ad placements within user-generated content, like TikTok, for example, where the videos are too short to place an in-stream ads, actually also starting to launch revenue sharing programs.
Mm. Wow. Okay. Interesting. All right. So I want to get into some of the specifics. I mean, you mentioned X. Can we talk a little bit about, you talked a little bit about YouTube. What kind of choices are they making about how this monetization takes place, and what rules supposedly exist, and are they following those rules?
Well, so I should maybe start by saying that there's roughly three categories, big categories of monetization services. So they are a what we would call a revenue redistribution programs or creator revenue share. The term differently, so like depending on the platforms. In some cases, also creator funds. This is money that is coming from the platforms themselves, where they decide to redistribute a part of their revenue, which may be coming from ads, may be coming from selling premium accounts, may be coming from other sources, with certain creators based on on formulas that are often sort of a little opaque and are subject to each platforms and operated slightly differently. And then you have a second set of services, monetization services, which for which the money comes from audiences. So platforms make available tools like subscription tools or gift or donation tools that allow creators and publishers to generate revenue from their audiences. And then finally, you have a third category of tools that are made available by the platform that allow creators to connect with brands and engage in partnerships with brands. Depending on the platform, those brand tools may or may not have their payments facilitated by the platform. In some cases, the platform just facilitates the connection, and then the publishers and the brands make their own contracts and their own payments. In some cases, the platform plays a part in facilitating the payment as well. With the audience tool, the platforms typically facilitate the payments. Although in the case of X, for example, they have a donation tool, which is just about featuring links to third-party platforms. So it can vary from platform to platform. But all of those services are what platforms define as monetization services. And so they all fall under platforms' monetization terms and monetization policies. Um, in some cases, platforms have now more developed terms for each program, but in like generally speaking, there are a set of rules that apply at a platform level around what actors are and are not allowed to make use of monetization services. Meta, for example, references those as its partner monetization policies. And those rules really explicitly say politicians and government actors are not entitled to monetize. Children under 18 are not allowed to use our monetization services. So there's sort of a list of actors that are typically restricted. Then you have a second layer of policies that touches on the type of content and behavior that is prohibited from monetizing. And these are typically sort of two different documents, but they can sometimes be combined. And then you have a minimum eligibility requirement that happen at the level of the program itself. So each service will require accounts to have a minimum of followers or a minimum of engagement over a certain period of time in order to be eligible to join the program. And yeah, to your question about how they're going about enforcing it. Well, on the one hand, it's hard to tell because a part of the problem is that platforms do not make much data available about their enforcement when it comes to monetization. But where we do have visibility, and that's mostly for Facebook, but we do have some visibility on other platforms as well. What we find out is that platforms are recurringly violating their own policies, and in some cases as well, seemingly providing monetization services to individual that by law they should not be entitled to. So a lot of our work over the last year, for example, has been to look at how platforms have been providing monetization services to accounts that are affiliated with entities under sanction, where it would seem like sort of the 101 of business due diligence, and the sort of the minimum due diligence that should happen is not happening. But we've also found thousands of accounts of politicians, political parties, that are monetizing, even though that's not necessarily allowed on Facebook. I mean, in fact, it's very explicitly prohibited in the Facebook and Instagram monetization policies. some really interesting examples. So recently we had the Prime Minister of Nepal self-disclosing that he had earned over $100,000 from platforms. Although in practice, I mean, in theory, he's not supposed um, to be able to even register for monetization. In Asia, we see a lot of police and military units that are signing up for this kind of services. We see a bunch of ministries. In some cases, the Ministry of Communication, which is in charge of regulating these platforms, actually monetizing from these platforms. So there's a whole array of actors that are, in theory, according to the policies, not allowed to access the services that are managing to get through whatever review process these platforms have in place and to still benefit from access. And again, as I mentioned, we have much better visibility for Meta because I've spent the last 7 years archiving those lists that Meta makes available. So we have this kind of long-lasting visibility, which we do not have for any of the other platforms. But those monetization policies also apply to a audience tools like subscription and tips, and those are tools that you can see uh, displayed directly on the accounts. And so we're able to kind of see that even though we don't have data on who participates in the program, we found, for example, accounts of entities under sanctions on YouTube, on TikTok, on X that were displaying sign of having access to monetization.
Mhm. So, I mean, I guess we kind of have two kind of clear issues here. One is platforms setting rules that they're not following themselves. And then the second being people who are clearly not supposed to be monetizing at all because they're under sanctions. And then there's, I think, other less clear categories beyond that. So, how do you explain the harms that are happening and how we might think about regulation?
Well, I think the first thing to say here, perhaps, is that we've talked a lot about how platforms are amplifying harmful content. We've talked a lot about how they're not doing enough to moderate what's happening on their platform. What we're looking at here really is platform not just amplifying, but actually paying for a lot of that content. So it's sort of one step above in terms of our responsibility, and not only really paying for that content, but through those payments, in many ways, incentivizing a behavior that is problematic in the first place, right? So if, to go back to my Myanmar example from the beginning, right? We have a situation in which either they are so bad that they're actually financing bad actors doing bad things that they should have actually been aware of, or there's a reason why this bad thing is there in the first place because the money that they're offering is actually leading and incentivizing actors that would not have engaged in that way to sort of make it their like full-time activity. And then because it's working, because they are making money, it's also providing the financing that allows these actors to scale their activity and to sort of automate it over and over, like in a much greater scale.
Right. So on the creator side, what does this look like? So how do you understand what creators are doing, how they are responding to incentives? What is it that they are seeing that is shifting their behavior?
Right. I mean, so as we mentioned, we've kind of have this like politically motivated actors, and in their case, the motivation is there regardless. What this actually does is mainly subsidize that activity, right? Then you have a not particularly political actors, but influencers that are actually dependent on a financing to sort of continue to sustain their activity. And I quite quickly realized that the more controversial they are, the more engagement their content will generate, and consequently, the more money they are able to make. And so we've seen this happen with a lot of individuals that started as minor influencers and became increasingly controversial because that was sort of a path for them to make increasing amount of money. That's sort of a small portion of the amount of accounts that are monetized. It's significant, but it's still sort of a portion of it. The long tail, the much bigger sort of set of accounts that we're dealing with, are faceless accounts that are massively automated. And so if you want to make more money, through those monetization program, if you want to optimize for like higher payouts, right? So it's either you go more extreme, but then you take the risk of actually being demonetized, or you scale. And to scale, you need like you get more accounts, you post more content. And so what we find is a lot of stakeholders that are automating the creation of thousands of accounts using software to manage all these accounts in a sophisticated fashion, and then sort of using generative AI to produce content at scale. And the software that underlie all of this have been really improving quite significantly over the last few years and becoming more and more sophisticated. So what we find is individuals that are running faceless accounts are now running a software that identify topics that are generating high engagement online, and that are then able to produce using generative AI content to sort of fit that topic. So we start to see a lot of the actors that are running faceless accounts. Many of them are based in Asia, but it's now expanding to other regions. We see them run accounts in many countries that they don't know the context of, in many cases don't know the language of, because using generative AI, they're now able to produce content in a scalable way to target those markets.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen examples of that here in Canada as well. So maybe could you talk to where this is showing up in our context here with the referendum?
Sure. Well, you had a couple great investigation actually by CBC recently. One which was looking at how a lot of accounts that were pertaining to be Alberta separatists were actually individuals based in places like Indonesia, that were doing it as a side business, producing or generating content, pumping out content in Canada because the situation you're facing generates a lot of engagement, and Canada is a higher paying market than Indonesia might be. And so this is a way for them to sort of optimize and increase their earnings. So you had this one investigation that looked specifically at accounts in Asia. You had another one that looked at individuals based in the Netherlands, young male in Netherlands that had also kind of realized that there was money to be made on the Alberta situation, and had a slightly more sophisticated operation because they were actually working through hired individuals that were reading out text. So it was not purely AI generated. So it's sort of two separate sort of models of the same activity. But again, the incentive being very much the same, registering for those monetization program and then optimizing for wherever the engagement is, and capitalizing on that engagement.
Yeah, I know in this the scenario of the women in the Philippines, I believe, who was mentioned in the CBC piece, they were flagging that she'd actually taken content from real separatists. So they were basically taking content that was organically posted by people who do support the separatist movement, and then amplifying that, using that to monetize. So there's a bunch of muddying that happens here because there is actual real speech that's happening here, but then there's people who are opportunistically taking advantage of this sort of heated topic, this sort of higher paying monetization scenario. And so obviously that has very big implications in a place where there's a referendum. And so we can imagine that anytime that there's going to be a controversy, any type of political controversy at all, that this becomes amplified. So what do we do about that?
That's a good question. I feel we're actually a little bit late in many ways. Because we're now faced with a dual problem in a way. On the one hand, we have to start to mitigate these incentives, and we have to find ways to stop new people from getting onboarded into these programs. And that starts with a really increasing transparency around who benefits so that there can be some oversight on who actually gets into this program. And there can be ways to make sure that platforms' terms and policies are actually being enforced. If you look at the situation today on all major platforms, there's no way to report an account that is monetizing in violation of policies. In fact, there's, in most cases, no way to know if an account is monetizing, which is sort of two problems we have to start tackling. On the one hand, setting up a monetization libraries that allow us to look at monetization relationships in the same way that we can look at advertising. At the moment, that does not exist. We need labeling at the content and at the account level. Again, very much like we do in advertising. On most accounts, you will actually have a label that will tell you if a post is an ad. You don't have a label that tells you that a piece of content is actually being remunerated by the platform.
Mm.
You don't have a label on the account that say that this account is currently registered for monetization.
Mm.
That's sort of the bare minimum. We should have that transparency, but also the option to then report accounts that are monetizing in clear violation of the platform's policies. Those two things don't currently exist, and they are sort of the starting point, I guess, here. But then we have a sort of a larger problem, which is that platforms have now been running these programs for a few years. Over the last 2 years in particular, we've seen a massive expansion, and we've seen millions of people turning to making this their full-time activity. So we have a lot of young people, early 20s, based in Asia, whose job it is basically day in, day out to use automation to pump out content wherever in the world it actually makes sense for them to do so. Um, the problem we're going to face is it's one thing to stop more people to get onto those programs that, aren't a authentic content creators. But then the second issue is going to be what do we do with these millions of people that have spent the last few years building the infrastructure, building thousands of accounts, buying automation software, setting up phone farms that allow them to run this operation. What are we going to do with these individuals? And what is going to happen to them if they stop making money from the platform? I think we should not be naive here and think that just because they're no longer going to get paid by the platforms, these individuals are going to disappear. In many cases, they've invested quite a lot of time, efforts, and money. And so I think we also need to think about what will happen of these accounts and these individuals and their infrastructure. Because otherwise, if we don't start to think about how to disarm this whole infrastructure, we really risk seeing these accounts just migrating over to other harmful activities. We've already seen some of the individuals that have built this infrastructure moving into disinformation for hire. There's a very high possibility as well that some of them will turn to scam. So we sort of have this huge pipeline of individual that could be highly problematic, and so we need transparency. We need to start enforcing the laws that we have, but we also need to think about what's the broader disarmament strategy for all these individuals that have been developing these capacities.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, a lot of what you're describing sounds quite a lot like what we are finding in our scams research as well. Just that there's entire infrastructures that are enabling this in a lot of the. So it's interesting to kind of see how this migration happens. And I think one of the other things that we're sort of seeing in that research is like these entire communities of people who are advising one another on how to set up these types of mechanisms as well. So it's not just that you're creating your own page, it's that you are basically creating communities of people who are advising each other and building a common infrastructure that you can have you monetize collectively, and then having these services. Okay, so yeah, so there's this big downstream effect of what happens to people. And I think about that also too, because it's a separate problem perhaps here, but I also think about what's happening with creators in a context where AI is now taking up all of their revenues. What happens to those folks? So there's a lot of consequences that are both like that are impacting because of the way that these tools are evolving. Okay, so just we are at getting pretty close to time. So I want to think a little bit more about where do we go from here? So I know that there's some conversations at the EU level. I know that there's some places where law actually already has a role to play. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Well, what we're looking at on our end, as a kind of sort of a primary thing here, right, is there are a lot of laws that are already on the book that are very likely already being violated. Again, I mentioned earlier that we find a lot of accounts affiliated with sanctioned entities accessing those services. That is already regulated effectively, and it could be a mechanism and an entry point to force platforms to provide more information about how their systems and their review processes actually work, and to fix some of the flaws of those systems. Equally, most countries have laws for campaign financing. And that could be an avenue again to also force platforms to integrate some guardrails into their monetization services. At the moment, we see political parties that have donation tools through the platform. Effectively, that means I can make a donation even if that's not necessarily legal for me to do so. Like I could make a donation to a Canadian political party if they were using those tools on Facebook, by me paying Facebook, Facebook then paying that party, even though it may not be legal for me as a non-Canadian to actually make a donation in your elections, right? So there are a lot of those problems that could be tackled through enforcing those existing laws and regulation. And again, here, the big missing piece is transparency. We need transparency around who actually has access to those services in order to be able to ensure that existing laws are being enforced. But I think those laws, because they're already on the book, because it's actually often quite a well-developed area of law, will be a very useful mechanism to start seeing progress fairly quickly. Then we have sort of the more nascent regulatory space of digital regulation. So in the EU, where I guess I'm the most familiar, we have the DSA and the DMA that look at regulating the way platforms operate. The Digital Services Act is very much a sort of a risk management type regulation. So it's sort of there to push platforms to identify and assess the risks and then develop mitigations to mitigate those risks. And there's definitely possibilities to ensure that platforms under that regulation actually start to assess what risks are stemming from their monetization practices, and then to adopt mitigation measures by improving their policies, their terms, their enforcement processes. So there's quite a bit of possibilities there. But I guess I mean, then you have the Digital Markets Act, and I think this has been a very interesting one because platforms are so the Digital Markets Act look at what it calls core platform services, and one of those core platform services is social media, but another one is digital advertising, and Meta and Alphabet have been qualified under the kind of digital advertising core platform service. And that comes with a set of obligations where they're supposed to provide transparency to publishers, they're supposed to provide transparency to advertisers. And at the moment, they're effectively saying that this does not apply to them when it comes to what's happening on their platform, which seems to suggest that they don't see themselves to be an advertising intermediary anymore, which will map out with the changes we've seen happen, but also kind of creates a bit of um, a bit of a gap in that regulation, and sort of prevent this regulation from actually applying here. So there are possibilities, I think, to expand, well, to interpret the existing regulatory package to address a lot of the challenges here, but also a need to look at what's missing, where the gaps actually are, and start addressing some of those gaps.
And a reminder, if you have any questions, please do add those in Slido. We will be going to those quite soon. And so, I mean, in somewhere like Canada, where we haven't yet sort of taken a an approach to regulation that, it seems like we might be going in a direction that's somewhat similar to the EU. This proposal of the online harms bill seems to be moving in this direction of a digital safety commissioner-esque type tool. So. But I would say that monetization is really not at all on the radar. It's still like, there's some design governance in there. There is a certain amount of content governance that's in there. I would say it's still pretty heavily content governance. This lens of monetization, even advertising really seems absent largely from this question of what should be regulated. So I think just even from a political question, a politics question, how do you start to get this question on the radar of policymakers at this critical moment? And I mean, that's a critical moment here in Canada because this evolving policy, but also in places where there is established policy and you're now trying to amend existing policy.
Well, this is where people like you come in. No, but we have look, in the EU context, I think there's a growing acknowledgement at the level of the European Commission as well as at the nation state level, that this is an issue that wasn't explicitly handled as it should have in the DSA, and there's now kind of work done in terms of like trying to kind of bring it in through interpretation. You have an opportunity with Canada to sort of expand beyond the DSA and sort of bring it in from the get-go, which will definitely be a lot easier than trying to push it in through other avenues. So what I'm hopeful is that in that sense, Canada can look at this and also, I mean, when the EU was negotiating and drafting the DSA and the DMA, platforms had a slightly different way of operating their monetization services. They've changed a lot since that drafting phase. Um, the advantage that you have as Canada coming in now is that we have a much better understanding of how the system function, and so I think there's a possibility here to try to regulate it more directly. If you look at the DSA, for example, the DSA does include a lot of elements around advertising transparency.
Mhm.
It would be possible for Canada to mirror that with monetization transparency and in a way start sort of leading the way among regulators in what this could look like. I think, I don't know if Ayla had this, but there was a slide up a couple of seconds ago that looked at the meta monetization archive that we've put together. This slide, right? So this is the front end of this massive database that archives all the lists that I've been backing up for Meta for the last 7 years. And part of the reason we went through this phase of putting it into a publicly searchable database was really to kind of show what a monetization archive could look like. So we can start to have informed discussions with regulators on what we should be expecting. Again, this is a condensed version of a CSV files that are made available by Meta every day. And then if you go to the website, if you go to monetization.wtf, you can actually play with the archive and look at any individual account and see a detailed timeline of what their monetization history was. I think we could have something like this be developed, again, very much in mirror to what we have with the ad libraries. It's very much the same idea. It's just that this time we need to start looking at the relationship between platforms and publishers and not just platforms and advertisers.
Mhm.
So I think Canada could really help pave the way in integrating some of those asks in text, where the EU at the moment is sort of having to work through interpretation of existing text.
Mhm. Yes, okay, that makes sense. I mean, I think also too, like even the advertising transparency such that it exists in terms of these libraries, we've seen over and over again that those are often not representative of what's happening because you will have studies that show what the ad library shows, for example, in an electoral context. But then you'll have people who are doing sort of public interest scraping projects demonstrating that, in fact, those advertising libraries represent only something like, in some case, I remember hearing one story was like it was only 50% of the ads that were actually being seen by the electorate during, very politically sensitive, moments like elections, and that actually, in fact, a significant part of the ads that were not being seen were like a much higher proportion of them were from foreign interference actors, and so just this idea that like what is not being captured in the libraries that are being presented is also needs oversight, and there needs researcher access and sort of protections for researchers to demonstrate that. So I would think that even if you kind of get to this, you still need this sort of transparency piece in place.
Yeah, you do. And that's why we're also asking for monetization library, but also account level and content level labels.
Yeah,
So that is actually a possibility.
yeah,
But even then, I think the difference here is when it comes to advertising, the message is Meta is making money from this actor. Meta
yeah,
is okay, or like I say Meta, but actually any platforms is making money,
yeah,
and kind of a pay to play service where they're actually amplifying content for money. So
yeah.
those two things are kind of the actions here. Um, and that's bad, and there's plenty of space for litigation.
Mm,
But what we're looking at here is the platform itself is paying third parties. And
yeah,
again, it's one thing for the platform paying a noodle seller in Indonesia that is pretending to be an Alberta separatist. That might not necessarily be ground for litigation. But when you start to see platforms paying terrorists, platforms paying sanctioned entities, platform paying CSAM actors,
mhm,
I think there's a slightly stronger ground there that we should be able to leverage to start to see litigation, strategic litigation take place in the
mhm,
next couple of years that can hopefully sort of force platforms into improving their processes quite
mhm.
drastically.
Yeah,
And also kind of create ground for regulators to be able to impose some form of transparency as a way to, for platforms to be able to show that they're showing goodwill in applying whatever commitment they make to improve.
Yeah, I mean, it seems with the design governance rulings in New Mexico on platform-enabled harms affecting youth, like it's not a direct parallel, but it does feel like there's some space in there for harmful practices that are kind of enabling this, that some of this ends up being potentially, it's just sort of the seeding for some of this. And I think also about scams. I mean, there's now litigation happening around the scams enablement as well. So yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, so I think we are going to turn to questions. We have two here from Sohan de Souza. Says more ambition than question. We need not to just current transparency of extant assets, but historical transparency of assets with on-platform searchable archiving. So maybe, and then he also says, should transparency requirements also not include cross-linking, so revealing how many at least monetized assets are being managed by or pay for to the same entity. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that?
I mean, I completely agree with Sohan. We need historical transparency, and I have to say, I've spent the last 7 years pressing a button every single day with my coffee, essentially single-handedly backstopping transparency on Meta's monetization. I'm ready to be done with this. So I'm very very much in favor of the platforms being actually required to maintain this transparency. I think it's totally it's totally impossible to expect tiny organization like ourselves on zero budget to maintain this kind of archiving. Again, as I mentioned earlier, we now have over 3 billion data points, no, entries, not data points, literally 3 billion entries in this database. I don't know if you imagine how complex this is getting, but we do not have the type of infrastructure that these platforms have. So this is very much something that I think we should very much start to see. And then in terms of cross-linking, I think this is something that I've been asking for some time as well. And it's, I don't know if Isla is sharing this, but we just put out some recommendation around what transparency around monetization could look like. And one, which to me is fairly basic, is all platforms already publish transparency reports on their content moderation. Not just their content moderation, in fact, they also actually have intellectual property reports and illegal content. In all of those cases, I think it would be very, very important to know what is the share of the accounts that are actually violating the policies or violating the law, violating copyrights that they themselves are financing. If you look at those reports at the moment, you often have a graph that says what share of the content is being detected by the platform itself versus what came from reports, right? That exact same graph will actually make a ton of sense if you could say what share of those accounts that you took down for violating your spam policy were actually monetized by you. What share of a content that was a hate speech content came from accounts that were actually being monetized by you? What share of a copyright violations that you identified as indeed proper, legit copyright violation came from accounts that you yourself monetize? Because this is where we start to see the systemic nature of the incentive. And I think, I mean, anecdotally, more than anecdotally, because we are looking at 19 million data points, but I haven't been able to analyze that in detail. But we consistently run into monetize accounts that are stealing content, monetize
Mm-hmm.
accounts that are pushing hate speech, monetize accounts that are engaged with illegal content, monetize accounts. So I think just having that, again, totally agree with Sohan that this should be a part of existing reports. Also, I would like to see platforms also publish data on the enforcement of their monetization policies.
Okay, thanks. That's really interesting. Okay, one more question here. Considering historical challenges to transparent social media, how can we build transparency in a way that respects privacy alongside corporate action?
Well, so if you look at what we have on the platform, for example, the platforms just provide the name of the Facebook page or the Facebook account and the handle. There is no information on the individual that actually is behind that page. That's information that actually platforms have obtained the consent of the publishers to make available within their terms, their monetization terms. So there's a clause in the monetization term that say that that data may be made available. Um, and it's not very different from what we see in the advertising space. So I think at least as a baseline, a moving towards a sort of equivalent type of transparency to what we have in the advertising space will be a very good starting point. And again, it's not about reinventing the wheels here. I think we can just start by asking for, there is label when it's an ad. We want label when the content is being remunerated. There's
Mhm.
label when an account is running advertising. We want label that says when an account is currently monetized and when it was previously monetized. If you look currently at the labels on Facebook pages, for example, it will tell you this account is not currently running ads. This account was previously running ads, political ads. Can have very much the same thing with regards to monetization. Equally, advertising library, we can look at how do we mirror that with a monetization library. I think that like there's currently a whole reporting flow so that you can actually report ads that are violating policies. There is no reporting flow so that you can report accounts or content that are violating monetization policies. Like
Mhm.
just starting with that as the baseline will already get us quite a long way forward.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it's great that there are models that are very, very comparable parallels. It makes it, I think, a lot easier to explain that to politicians who are trying to think through what this looks like, maybe. I think we are coming up on on the end. Maybe just before we wrap, one final thought that you want to leave the audience with?
Perhaps encourage you to visit this transparency portal we put forward called monetization.wtf, which in addition to having this whole archive, this meta monetization archive, which is all the Facebook and Instagram accounts that have been part of Meta's revenue redistribution since 2019. It also has pages for YouTube, TikTok, X, Snapchat, I'm forgetting one, but that provides sort of an overview of the existing programs, existing revenue redistribution programs, as well as what the requirements are and what some of the underlying policies are. So I would very much encourage you to take a look at this. And if you're undertaking research and investigations, it is very often worthwhile to look at whether there is a monetization angle. To what you were saying earlier, Renee, I think what we are finding is a lot of content that a lot of investigations end up interpreting as political content that may not be. So again, to take the example of the Indonesian lady stealing content from a genuine Alberta separatist, the content may have been genuine to start with, but it then gets redistributed by people that have absolutely no notion or understanding of the context and may not actually know at all what it is that they are sharing. And I think we need to be better at separating these things because we tend to give political intent when there's not necessarily one. We
Yeah.
saw that a lot, for example, when Twitter gave visibility on where the accounts were located, and there was all of a sudden this outcry that a lot of the MAGA accounts were actually based in Thailand and in Myanmar.
Yeah.
And again, very much the same thing. It's, MAGA content pays.
Mhm.
That's been known for quite a while. Back in 2016, we had a whole town in Northern Macedonia that was getting rich on the back of that.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
it's sort of this. So I think
Yeah.
encouraging you to not be too quick to give a political intent. The content may have been produced for political purposes, but we find content gets repurposed multiple time over.
For
And
different
it's
reasons,
really
motive.
key to understand what is
Yeah.
the actual motivation of the person sharing the content, because if we want to go about undermining that sharing, we really need to actually use the right tool, and the tool is not the same
Mhm.
depending on the motivation that are behind that distribution.
Mhm. I mean, you're reminding me that, I mean, this is not new. This is a decade old at the very least. I mean, this was very much a factor. I remember the interview CNN did with the Macedonian guys who were basically capitalizing on things like Pizzagate, and saying like, yeah, we're just getting ourselves ready for the next election because this is making us so much more money. We can't make any money anywhere else at this level. We're the richest people in town. So I mean that incentive is going to drive a lot of people, and so how do you address that? All right, Victoire, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I learned so much from you. Just really appreciate your time and expertise. I know all too well how hard it is to be a small organization with no resources trying to do this. Yeah, thanks so much for everything you're bringing into this. I'm certainly going to be here in the Canadian context trying to bring this up with the government as we're trying to pass our new version of the online harms bill. I hope others can take inspiration from this, draw on Victoire, support her work as well. And yeah, just thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you very much.